My name's Hugh Jones, CEO of Steer, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight on this wintry night to our Movement Matters event. Movement Matters is Steer's platform for contemporary, for topical, for lively, for enlightening discussion. Tonight's topic is a fascinating topic: infrastructure investment in the new economy. It's a topic that's relevant to today. It's a topic that's really close to our heart in Steer, given the work we do to support infrastructure transactions globally. I am thrilled that guiding us through this fascinating issue is a very rich, a very diverse, a very broad panel. And they will share with us tonight their expertise, their perspectives, their insights. Joining us this evening, here at the front, Baroness Jenny Randerson, the Liberal Democrat spokesman for transport in the Lords; André Gibbs, partner at property developer Argent; Paul Davies, advisor to the Infrastructure Forum; and Jolanta Touzard of Aviva Investors. Our format for tonight is for each of our four panellists to share with you their thoughts from their unique perspectives on the challenge of infrastructure investment in the new economy. We will work through the panel, and then we will have an opportunity for question and answer session. So it's not just the panel and myself doing the work, it is also your good selves as well. So what brings us together tonight? What gives this topic interest and depth? There is no doubt that there is near complete consensus that high quality, resilient, affordable infrastructure is essential for competitive and inclusive economies, and economies that also support growth and jobs. But it is clear that that challenge is one that sits in a high level of complexity. The future project pipeline is likely to be hugely more complex than what has gone before. Today, like no other, the infrastructure sector needs to consider how best to harness the opportunities delivered by technical advancement, how best to capitalise on the shift that we are seeing in business models. There are fundamentals that continue to challenge us. How do we address and take opportunity from climate change? How do we deal with the growing demands that are placed on our cities and networks of all forms, particularly at a time when user preferences and the tolerance for disruption is probably heading to an all-time low? And that is set against further complexity, both political and economic. Looking to the near term, in the build-up to the UK general election, we also see two political parties offering a very different focus, a very different set of perspectives on the role of the state, the role of the private sector, and the role of private capital. Notwithstanding that point, there seems to me to be a clear picture that the private sector and private capital will have a clear role to play in delivering the anticipated £600 billion of investment that is making up the pipeline here in the UK. And the goal really is to mobilise that capital, to mobilise that expertise, and to do so against the backdrop that I've just described. And I believe our panel will take us through that particular challenge as we move through this evening's Movement Matters events. So let's start. And I'd like to introduce to you all Baroness Jenny Randerson.
Good evening, everyone. When I was asked to do a talk on the view from Westminster, it seemed pretty straightforward a couple of months ago. Now I think there are a number of views from Westminster, at least three different approaches to these issues. The Labour Party is unequivocally in favour of renationalisation of the railways, of all utilities, and in the case of broadband, we'll even give it to you free. The Conservatives have been, I would say, probably deliberately vague in their manifesto, which was anyway pretty short. And they have gone to great lengths while in government prior to this election not to clarify the future of some of the major infrastructure projects. HS2, for example, and the third runway at Heathrow. And then we also are waiting for the Williams report on the future structure of the rail industry. So all of them are still in the balance. Looking at the major parties, the Liberal Democrats are not in favour of an overall reorganisation of ownership of the railways, for instance, but we are very much in favour of a big investment in infrastructure, upgrading our transport and energy systems, rebalancing our economy through big regional investment in the north, for example, and a big investment in public transport. Overall, therefore, that picture is that the days of austerity are gone, and every main party has signalled major investment in infrastructure. And politicians have at last woken up after decades of underinvestment, where we've not kept pace with rising population, with advancing technology, and with the concerns on climate change. You know, Mrs. Thatcher famously disliked public transport, so she didn't spend money on it. In fact, she started the sell-off. And even Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister for a long time in a period of plenty, made a disappointing level of investment in major projects. And what he did invest was often on a sort of PFI basis, which is now seen as unpopular. I believe we as a country have got ourselves into a very bad place where we find it difficult to build any major project. There are exceptional time delays between inception of the idea and actually getting the work started on the ground. Look at the third runway. An idea which has been kicking around for so many decades that the answers have come and gone several times. HS2 has been around for a long time now. Now, these delays are blamed on the planning system and on political debate. And I must admit, you know, we talk about HS2, the committee looking at it, looks at it for months at a time, because there are thousands of protesters. But I'm, as a firm believer in democracy, I believe that we've got to the point where our democratic process on these things, where they are so unwieldy that it is in itself undemocratic because of the huge delays and lengthy uncertainties. You know, you can go on forever. One man's green travel solution is another man's loss of ancient woodland, and is therefore a total environmental disaster. That I take an example from HS2. So if you combine this system with the frustrating short-termism of the political cycle, you get a problem. Governments think in 5 years cycles maximum. Lately, they've been thinking in 5-month cycles rather than 5 years. Now, that's true in all democracies, but our first-past-the-post system produces bigger swings, and they go to the extremes, and hence there's greater instability and less consensus on some of the big ideas. It's not just infrastructure, it includes things like social care for the elderly. The National Infrastructure Commission was established to get over this problem, but hasn't had the powers or the budget to follow through on their research and vision. So that needs reform to start with. You need secure and stable government to allow it to have the vision and the political will to deliver on major projects. And such governments have been in short supply recently. In the last few years, we've had a government that was effectively in denial about some of the big issues on technological innovation, and certainly in denial about the urgent need for action to counteract climate change. And I give you, ladies and gentlemen, the example of the Swansea Bay tidal lagoon, an idea which kicked around for years, and the government gradually, achingly got to the point where it said no to it. By then, it had lost a lot of its impetus. Now, if you combine political instability with a civil service, I don't want to offend any civil servants here, but the civil service's job is to stop ministers taking risks. And you have a recipe for inaction if you have instability and the civil service advising you not to do anything yet, Minister. There are other factors too. I can't go any further without referring to the B word. Brexit has proved an unwelcome distraction for government, ministers, and for the civil servants, and for Parliament. There has been no legislation of any significance coming through for years now. The only thing I've had any involvement in as a member of the House of Lords has been the issue of getting ready for a no-deal Brexit. That was dozens, hundreds of pieces of minor legislation that civil servants spent many hours over that would not be used if there is no deal, and it looks as if that mountain has been overcome. But it's also a problem for business and for investors, of course. The hope is that 2020 might be better, but we will lose valuable additional funding from the European Investment Bank if and when we leave the EU. And we need to have plans for a strong green investment bank to replace it. And all this compounds the skills problem, which is exemplified with the electrification of the Great Western Line. We haven't built anything involving the electrification of railways for so long that the Great Western electrification was over budget because no one was still working in the industry who had experience of management or the skills needed for building it. That was a problem. The then Secretary of State, Chris Grayling, said, oh, this is costing too much, so we won't do electrification, we'll do hybrid instead. So instead of taking the best, we grabbed a compromise. We had, therefore, left it so long to do this that it was too late to take advantage of the skills we'd learned before. Now, Great Western, just like Crossrail, illustrates that even when we have the structure firmly in place, we still can't deliver big projects efficiently. The move to reliance on private sector management and finance was made, ladies and gentlemen, in the 1980s. But over 30 years later, we still haven't settled on a satisfactory model. Despite PFI and PPP, we haven't sorted out where the risk should rightly be placed. And we haven't created a model where the market really works. We have a model which allows the creation of overmighty, overblown, unwieldy mega companies, I give you Carillion, that dominates the market. And when they go bust, that leads to a real crisis of confidence in that sector. And we have created a model where an astonishingly high percentage of the key companies are foreign-owned investors. Now, I love foreign-owned investors, but I wish there were more British-owned investors too. In other words, we want a model which is more identifiably ours, that fits the British scene. Despite the Corbynite attempt to rerun the 1950s in this election, I suspect we're not likely to return to big state ownership. Instead, we need a more robust PPP model, one where there is a bigger government role, perhaps, in initiation and direction of projects, And I'd like to see a bigger role for local government, which often knows really well what it wants. Maybe more powers and money for organisations like Transport for the North should be the first priority. And we need funding that reinforces political priorities. For example, roads funded by road user pricing. We need more flexible structures with the emphasis on responsible capitalism, delivering on government priorities on technology and the environment. But increasingly, I think private sector investment will be expected to follow public sector ambitions, and public sector investment will be expected to maintain private sector standards and expectations in terms of efficiency and detailed project specification. The public sector has got to work to the high standards the private sector expects before it starts a new project. So that'll be no more garden bridges, let alone a bridge between Wales and Ireland.
Baroness Jenny Randerson, many thanks. I think at a time when not just our eyes, but the eyes of the nation are on Westminster, for you to shine a light into what is going on and paint that picture, something we were all very grateful for. I was particularly taken by your references to the differences in manifestos, but the recognition that the challenges and problems that face any incoming government are actually common to them all. Anyway, let's move on. I'd like to introduce to you all now André Gibbs of Argent to give the perspective of a developer. André.
Hi. I'm going to talk about slightly smaller things. So we'll talk a bit about King's Cross and also about Brent Cross, which are two large developments which sit adjacent to new transport investment. Transport is always a national infrastructure, but also there's always an expectation that it enables development and also an expectation that it pays for some of the transport that has gone in. But it's not always that simple. So this is a picture which was taken in film, believe it or not, before digital. This is when the railway was coming. This is St Pancras station in the first phases when they were putting in the new tunnel rail link terminal. King's Cross was a mess in many ways at that point in time, massive construction site, but this investment was coming and effectively was going to solve all of the transport problems in this area, and to a degree it did. This is what the site looks like now, and new coming in graduates, when they come into our company, think that it's all easy. You just get this plot and you just stick a building up. I'm like, what's so hard about that? And that's roughly what it'll look like in about 2 years' time. So going back to the idea that the railway's coming, people waving their flags, it's a bit like this. King's Cross is exceptionally well served with a large regional and strategic and national infrastructure. This is the ring main, which the main Thames water ring main. Along the canal is a 400 kilovolt power cables which go down to City Road and up near Lords. We have the largest gas governor in I don't know. We think it's certainly London. We think it's the UK. It might be Europe. We make that up and nobody challenges it, but it's huge. And it serves the entire West End. So in terms of the economy it serves, it's enormous. But there isn't actually very much infrastructure which serves the site. And so it's not just the railways where we have this problem of how do you make this step down in having large national and regional bits of infrastructure to actually making it of any use to the site. So when we look at this site and people get all excited, it's all done for you. Actually, it's only really just begun, because we've got to put in huge amounts of infrastructure, be that earthworks, remediation, pipes and wires in streets, squares, fountains, if you like, that sort of thing, and energy infrastructure. Here are some pictures of some wonderful district heating pipes and our CHP engines. If you throw your mind back to 2008, around September, for those of you in the finance industry, that was a bit of a bugger moment. When Lehman finally went bust, although we could kind of see something was going to happen leading up to that. And we had the benefit, where other people had failed, we had the benefit of about £150 million of cash coming in from British Telecom pension scheme, which we could actually use to invest in infrastructure. So we put in place this framework of infrastructure, which sorted out relationship with the railways and put a vague network around. But where this actually got us was a position where, to develop any one of those plots, you would have to, if you sold a completed building or if you retained it at 65% debt, most of the plots you couldn't actually pay for. If you wanted to retain any of them, you couldn't actually pay for it, because the amount of infrastructure you triggered to deliver that one plot would kill you. Whereas if you wanted to sell off some completed buildings, you could just about get there with one or two of them. So it's this massive hurdle that you get at the beginning of all these larger schemes, even though there's great national infrastructure. So we started recycling cash and putting in an enhanced framework of infrastructure. And by the time we did that, we're about £250 million in infrastructure. And it got us to a stage where we could actually sell things or start thinking about retaining the buildings, and our offices actually happen to be in the first building we retained. Now, once you actually start going and putting these things in and start recycling that cash, you're off. But this is just an indication that you need to find ways of getting about £250 million in of recycling assets before you're actually in a position where you can actually hold on to anything. So it's a pretty challenging stuff. Comparable challenge. So anyone would think, why the hell am I here? Why don't I just retire? This is just madness. I've spent 20 years on that. Why do I start it all over again? So Brent Cross South, not quite as much of a mess, not quite as notorious, known for a shopping centre. In a way, less of a transformation that we can make. But there's been a large scheme. This was being consulted on when we were consulting on King's Cross. So this has actually been a harder challenge to get going. But a new train station is coming forward. Brent Cross, London, is a shopping centre, which is not going to come forward in that form, but may or may not come forward in due course. And Brent Cross South, the development that we're involved with, big master plan, 180 acres, 10 million square feet, 6,700 homes, what's not to like? But it's challenging, and we've had to break it down into individual phases. We've got a phase of a mixture of offices and predominantly residential, some student accommodation coming forward. But to set us up as a core which connects us into the station for when we bring forward all of this, the challenge is that to get this going, again, we need to make quite a large infrastructure play to actually get that off. We need to build a school, we need to sort out some parks, we need to do some public spaces, we need to do remediation, and on that diagram alone is about £150 million of infrastructure. So how do we actually, well, it's probably about 120, but how do we get going with that? And in this case, we don't have this big chunk of equity. Well, fortunately, Homes England has an infrastructure fund, which we've working closely with them to get that in place, which will give us some longer-term secured finance with opportunities to recycle that cash, which will allow us to put in place that infrastructure on the basis that we will in due course sell down those plots. It's a very difficult to get financing like that in the general market. It's most investors say, well, what's your time frame? And you say even the patient ones, pension funds used to be okay with this, but even the patient ones, their time frame is, well, are you going to be out in 5 years? And I said, well, I might be, but if there's a market slowdown, I won't be. And then they say, well, call me when you're ready to do the buildings. So whereas with Homes England, they recognise that actually being able to make that move and put in more in place actually accelerates the delivery of everything. It in fact de-risks it, but there's quite a leap of faith that has to be made at that point. But if you have a long-term horizon, which goes beyond 5 years or 2 parliaments, 10 years, you can actually make these decisions, which you put in place stuff and recognise that even if there's market disruption along the way, it's going to come good and you can work your way through it. If you can't make that, you end up being very incremental, and the big moves that you want to actually deliver, you never can actually make the jump that you need to make these things, to kick these things off. So I'll leave you there with some of those thoughts and come back later.
André, many thanks. Aren't they just transformational, those images? And for you to talk us through the journey, the complexity of both the practical delivery challenges and the financing challenges on those brownfield sites was really, really insightful. Thank you very much. So let's move on. And our next speaker is Paul Davies. Paul, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So Hugh asked me to talk a little bit about sort of financial models, exactly where infrastructure is going, governance, and sort of where the investment for the next decade or so. And for me, I've had a background very much in transport, as a large number of geeks in the audience here there as well. So I worked on tube, rail, shipping. I'm now advising the CAA on the next runway, which is fun, and I'm advising DfT on trains. So in theory, should be doing transport. And I've also been advising the Infrastructure Forum on governance. What should we do that's different than if you like, some of the discredited models that Jenny was describing earlier on? And in particular, the question I've asked in some papers I've done for the Infrastructure Forum, which is, why is the private sector the natural custodian of what are public assets? What are they doing that means that they merit that? And I think my view is there's some good answers to those questions, and there are some times where it's fallen short. But given I'm, in theory, also a transport geek, I'm actually going to talk about a completely different sector, which is carbon capture and storage. Why? Well, 2 things. One, I chair the Carbon Capture and Storage Advisory Group, which is a group of 30 companies and government trying to push the industry ahead for the next decade or 2. But 2, the conclusions that we've come to on the business models and what we need to do, I think are relevant for whatever sectors you're going to be in. So I'm going to leap into CCS and just give you a bit of context. So, CCS, what is it? Carbon capture and storage sort of says what it does on the tin. So you take the processes and you put the CO2 into the ground as part of that process. And I'll just give you a couple of facts which sort of give you the context of what that's about. Renewables, everyone sort of said it's been fantastic. Since 1997, our carbon CO2 consumption in the UK has only fallen by 3%. And whilst we've embraced renewables, 2 things have happened. Number 1 is our consumption has been offshored more and more. More and more we're buying goods from other countries, so the CO2 content's actually in the goods we buy. And the second thing, which is where CCS comes in, is that renewables actually only touch about 30 to 40% of the energy use in the UK. Large swathes of heating and industry basically are untouched by renewables, and that's the problem, which is why the Committee on Climate Change says that CCS is an essential technology. Just to give you some stats, this will be slightly meaningless, but it'll give you an idea. Power pukes out about 115 million tonnes of CO2 per annum. Buildings, probably 100 million tonnes. Industry, just at the 5 main industrial clusters around the country, probably 150 million tonnes per year. Transport, these are base figures, by the way, government figures. Transport at the moment, 120 million tonnes in the UK, and then aviation and shipping add another 60 million tonnes. We are producing a lot of CO2. And that's why the Committee on Climate Change has suggested we need CCS to take at least 200 million tonnes out of the UK's economy per annum to get to net zero. So that's the sort of background of why it's essential. In terms of how it works, there are a range of various technologies and business models, but essentially 3 key ones for you guys to be aware of. The first one's called post-combustion. So basically, after you've burnt your fossil fuel, either in a power plant or in a major industry or refinery. You capture the CO2 in the chimney, strip it out, about 95% gets stripped out, liquefy it, and then you put it back into old disused oil and gas fields. The other one is probably more interesting for transport, which is pre-combustion, where using steam, effectively you split methane into two things, CO2 back in the ground and hydrogen. And that hydrogen is the start of actually the main revolution that should happen in this economy. Because the hydrogen can be in power plants, but again in transport and all the sectors I've just described, which are hard to reach by renewables and other means. Where molecules are needed, that's where you'll start using and transition to a hydrogen economy. So that's the sort of big thing. And the third one, probably most interesting as well, which is called BECCS, Bioenergy with CCS. And there, take Drax, for instance, Drax, the UK's largest power plant, it's trying to switch to BECCS. When it burns wood pellets, what it does is actually it's taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Because if you grow trees and wood pellets, which is absorb CO2, so it's actually negative emissions. And important in the transport sector, because for things like aviation, where you can't offset, what do you do about it? Well, actually, that will do a negative emission to offset the positives we can't control in things like aviation. So I think you'll see that as a growing sector. So that's broadly what it is. In terms of business models, and I'm going to do a whirlwind tour, the CAG recommended in July, 250-page report, the business models. For those of you who are sleep deprived, you can get it on the CCSA website. What it said was, first and foremost, don't reinvent the wheel. Use existing models. There is investor appetite and excitement if you do it, and they understand it. So for the transmission and storage part of CCS, which is basically the pipes that get it from the power plants and put it into the oil fields, use what's called a regulated asset-based model. So the major utilities, Network Rail, and more recently Thames Tideway Tunnel. It's proven, cost of capital extraordinarily low, and it can deal with, so take Thames Tideway Tunnel, massive sewer through London, 2.49% was the cost of capital, really low. So where it's very important to have low cost of capital and where you've got a structure which needs to be able to grow and adapt, because it's not like a project finance, you'll need to keep changing and building this store and accommodate new projects, have a RAB, because it can accommodate that. Second one is for things like the power projects and major industrials, probably just classic project finance. So in the wind sector, they had what was called, or they still have, contracts for differences. So a fixed payment from government, which is paid relative to the energy price. It gives stability to investors. Jolanta, who's up next, will tell you that, she loves that. That gives them a predictable return. And it's incited competition as government has let more of these contracts, and the price of wind has come down. What we want to do in CCS is emulate that. So for major power projects, for industrial decarbonisation, try and use those and become more competitive, push the price so eventually it's equal to and lower than its major competitors, existing fuel and competitive with renewables. For transport, that's going to be trickier actually for those transport geeks, because with transport, there's not like one big project. What we're talking about here is a transition over the next 20 years to using hydrogen for things like HGVs where you couldn't use electricity. And for that to happen, you need CCS at scale, so reliable hydrogen around the UK, and you will need lots of places where I can fill up, because it's the same problems with electricity. I won't do it unless I know I can get reliable hydrogen around the UK. So quite a big range there of what's needed. The conclusions on that, use proven models, there is investor appetite, and just don't try and break models that are fixed or popular. The last thing I'll just put on is governance, just one sort of quick point on governance, and it's an obsession of mine. The models to date have had the main problems and why people dislike them because of some poor behaviours, I think, on some of these governance. A lot of financial engineering, high levels of dividends that have given it all a bad name. New governance and new models needs to address this and think, again, why am I the natural custodian of public assets? So work with customer representation, think about your financing and the financing structure, make sure it works in that way. So CCS, I think what we're recommending for that is exciting and it will embrace transport, but it's all indicative. The models we're recommending, I think, should work in whatever sector you're thinking about doing. So that's it, and I'll pass to questions for later on. Thank you.
Paul, many thanks. I think the scale of some of those numbers you mentioned in terms of the emissions are huge. And whilst it was very clear, you pointed to the different business models and different forms of finance. What came out for me was the need to take an economy-wide and holistic approach to really deliver on that overall policy agenda around carbon reduction. So let's move on to our final speaker of the evening. I'd like to introduce to you all, ladies and gentlemen, Jolanta Touzard of Aviva Investors to give the view from the equity perspective. Jolanta.
Hello. I'd like to give you a perspective of an investor. I represent a fund that manages about 11 billion sterling assets, and those are predominantly in energy, but also transport, energy from waste. And what I'd like to focus on is energy and is the shift in risk spectrum that investors are experiencing. So when I started investing in energy, that was probably 7 years ago, one of the first investments I made was into wind. And that was a fully ROC-funded project, so the exposure was a little bit to the power market, to energy prices, and then predominantly to effectively subsidies. At that point, people were very wary, investors were very wary of those kind of investments, and not understanding and coming from the point of view of projects that are fully supported by availability revenues. Those were considered quite risky assets, and therefore returns were quite good on them. So what happened just over the last 7 years, that we have shifted from people being worried about it to people very much wanting those kind of assets because they are disappearing from the market. They are predominantly there in the secondary market, but not in the primary market. Subsidies are no longer there. At Aviva, we were lucky that we started a few years ago, so we still have some assets which are supported by feed-in tariffs, so 100% of your revenues are quite secure, so you're just sitting on those and diversifying your portfolio. However, what's happening today, and the appetite for investments is still there. Investors into our funds will be pension funds or insurance companies, and they very much want to invest their money into infrastructure because that's a diversifier into their portfolio, into equity bonds or real estate, which recently have not been performing that well. And those infrastructure assets, even if they're exposed purely to the merchant market, still are fairly stable, counter-cyclical, often risk linked to inflation. So what we've seen since 2015, between 2015 and today, we had doubling of investor appetite. So the way this is demonstrated, so in 2015 we had about 30 billion of US dollars in Europe of dry powder to be invested into infrastructure. Last year we had 60 billion. So that really shows you that pension funds and insurance companies really want to do these projects. And how do we, the managers of their funds, convince them that the assets today are still worthy of investing and the risks are still manageable compared to the risk that existed there or didn't exist there actually 7 or 10 years ago. So if you look at an availability asset such as PPP project, the risks were mainly underperformance of your operators. So maybe if you took construction risks, just the construction risk, but also heavily managed and supported, managed through contracts really and supported by the government. Today, the type of projects I'm working on are gas peaking plants. So small plants which going to support the move from carbon economy to hopefully zero net carbon. And I'm being slightly controversial here because those are gas peaking plants, so they're using gas and therefore emitting carbon. However, what they are doing in an energy market which is using a lot of renewable energy, you have to have some kind of support from plants which can release energy very quickly. And this kind of assets can release energy within 3 minutes of switching them on. And they will be needed because if by 2025 we switch off coal and some of the nuclear, we will lose about 14 gigawatts of power, and we will probably need a lot more to support electric vehicle charging, and we'll need even more to decarbonize heating. So on these kind of assets, what I'm dealing with and the risks I'm dealing with, it's purely exposure to the market. Every single revenue type, it comes from the market, from the energy market. Every single revenue type is forecasted. So before we had, just a few years ago, we had some kind of embedded benefits, and those will last probably another year or two, but will slowly wither away or will become costs. So that means that the whole exposure of the entire investment is really to the energy market, which is totally unpredictable, because if you take one of the key 3 or 4 forecasters of power prices, they all give you different numbers and they will never be true anyway. Really investors are taking on a lot more risk, and probably the reason why at Aviva, we are able to take that risk is because we don't have any leverage, and we don't need to convince banks and funders that there is some kind of floor that we will achieve. We take that risk on us. And how we manage those risks is also by quite heavy and hands-on asset management, but also a portfolio mix. So if a fund is large enough, it can mix with other type of assets. So, for example, there's I believe, and it will be proven over time, where if you have a number of your investments invested into wind or solar, and then you mix it up with gas peaking plants or energy from waste, you ultimately selling electricity at different times of the day, and you're producing electricity at different times of the day. So therefore, your risks are some more combined and managed. So saying all of that, we still see a bit of stalemate caused by Brexit and questions, and I agree with Jenny that, that kind of total diversion of attention from what needs to be done on the ground to other things and management of potential risks that might never be there. That's within the government, but that's within companies as well, such as our company. But for me, what governments can do are 3 things. Provide funds, provide supportive legislation or restrictive legislation. So supportive legislation would be subsidies, encouragement to invest, in this case, in energy, in renewable energy, and a restrictive legislation would be you have to close coal plants, or you have to pay your carbon taxes. I also agree, Jen, with you on the point that local governments should play a really big role, because they could really help with decarbonizing heating through district heating, through setting up small power plants. What's really needed is that very concise and stable drive and message from the government. These things are happening. So they're either happening because they're on paper and there is regulation about it, or because of funding. I think at the moment there is a lot of uncertainty, and we don't see that those messages are long-term messages. Thank you.
Jolanta, many thanks. To talk us through the chronology, the shifting risk appetites and the growth of funds was fascinating. I was particularly taken by the very powerful, very positive contribution that equity can make in the example that you gave. I thought that was very, very insightful, and I think we all support your position of seeking a clear position from government on some of those points you raised at the end of your talk with us here this evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree, the speakers have taken us on an extensive, wide and interesting journey through tonight's topic, and I'd like to invite the speakers to join me here on the stage for our Q&A session. So you've heard lots. There must be questions. So I turn to the floor. Who would like to get us going, please? Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeremy Long, MTR. Conscious in the room, I'm sure there are people with very different appetites, equity appetites, debt appetites, delivery appetites, even, dare I say, those with an appetite to sort out projects that might be going wrong. If we were looking at this altruistically in terms of value for money for the taxpayer, in terms of ultimately whole life cost of a hypothetical very large project, what would the panel say was the most appropriate mix of use of public sector, private sector, finance, delivery mechanisms, risk management, etc., for the taxpayer?
Jeremy, thank you. An outstanding opening question, asking the panel what mix they see as being appropriate for a mega project. Paul, if I could turn to you first to answer that question.
In the papers I've written before, I've said actually, you can do a blend of each, and I actually think having some public and privates alongside each other would be useful in the future, because quite often, for instance, with PFI, there was no public sector comparator, so it got slanged off. People in the PFI sector were saying we're marvellous, and no one believed them. And actually having a mix between the two is quite helpful. I think there's probably a wider need for private sector than people at the moment politically is appealing to say, because of the history of doing it, the expertise, and how much has been done in the private sector. But it does need to get over some of the problems of the past. So cost of capital is difficult in a number of areas, and so trying to have a model, one of the reasons for recommending the RAB model in carbon capture, for instance, was emulating Thames Tideway. When the cost of capital at 2.49 is hardly any more than the government's cost of capital, then actually people understand it much better. They say, well, in that case, for the expertise you get, that makes sense. If you're doing something with a high cost of capital, think again. Secondly is, if you've got sectors where you can get quite a lot of competition, then again, having the private sector model helps. So in wind, where government did do what Jolanta was doing, which I was recommending, which was let out a series, time after time, of contracts against which people bid, you saw what happened to pricing. And actually the same happened in things like PFI hospitals. The pricing came down over time. So if there's a competitive dynamic, certainly the private sector will deliver that. But at early markets, beginning of carbon capture and storage, some greater public sector involvement to get it going certainly will be helpful. And there are some difficult risks at the outset, which maybe they may be to be not fund, but be the backstop. So for instance, if there was a failure of a carbon store, which no one is predicting, but if it stopped working and so the whole project had to be abandoned, that's not a risk you could put to the private sector and only give them a 5% rate of return, let's say. They might take that risk for a 25% rate of return, but not for 5%. So given that's an unlikely event, the government could step in as a insurer of last resort. So there's a role, but it's not necessarily financing. So that's a long answer, but...
Paul, thank you. I think given the nature of the question, I'd quite like to invite Jenny Randerson to give the perspective from the public sector and the policy view before moving to my other colleagues on the panel.
Well, when I spoke, I referred to the problem we have, that we haven't really settled on the right place for who is going to bear the risk. And of course, it won't always be the same place for every project, as Paul has just indicated. So I would say that it is quite obvious that in the rail industry, the current franchising system, the risk is not in the right place. And anyone who is a regular train traveller would be likely to say the whole system is unsatisfactory, but we are in the position at the same time that the number of people, number of organisations, companies bidding for franchises is tiny. and so there isn't proper competition in that market. So the government has to rethink how it does that, and I think one of the problems is that no government has, as currently constituted, the right mix of skills and experience. The civil service, if I can digress for a little bit, the civil service is based on generalists. I was a minister for 3 years in the Wales office. There is now virtually no one left in the Wales office who was there when I was there and ceased to be there. I stopped in 2015. They've all moved on, and most of them have gone to housing or health or something completely different. And they're applying their great brains and their huge educations to a set of general principles. Well, they need to be they need to be added to by experts, proper experts, not people who just acquire a bit of expertise by being in a department for 2 or 3 years. People who have the right background, the right level of skills and expertise from the industry that they are going to set rules and arrangements for.
Jenny, thank you. And André and Jolanta, is there anything you'd care to add?
Sure. Certainly in my industry, I think where the public sector can, there's a difference between where the money comes from and where the skills come from, and but basically, it goes back to the point that was made earlier about that when you widen the market, you widen the opportunity, you increase the market for the number of people who are actually going to see that as something as an interesting place to put their money. Private sector money generally becomes relatively cheap, where the size of something or the risk appetite, like putting £150 million of infrastructure in the ground on a bunch of land where nobody's actually committed that they're actually going to buy anything, although you're pretty sure it will happen, is the number of people in the private sector who would look at that. You start to get in, what's the time horizon? When am I going to get it back? Where are all my guarantees coming from? And it becomes quite difficult. Where's my security? Everything. And even if I had the whole land as a security package, who could I sell it to anyway? Because there are only about 2 or 3 people who would take that on in the first place. So in those circumstances, I think if you want to do something of that sort of scale, the public sector, who should have generally a long-term view, which is saying, is this a project that when it happens is actually going to contribute beyond the profit and loss account of the development? Is it going to be bringing housing? Is it going to be promoting infrastructure? Is it going to be promoting low carbon economy? Is it going to be providing education? Is it going to have an impact which goes beyond the footprint of its self-contained scheme? Is it, the government should be in a position where they can say, I know this is going to pay for itself, but market cycles are so long and the scale of this is so long that actually we can provide investment into the things which actually chunk it down into smaller private sector, smaller competitive bits. So not just through money, but through processes like CPO and land assembly, through the byproducts of major infrastructure projects like the railway projects that happened at King's Cross. If it can actually take a lot of the risks which make it difficult for private sector money to even contemplate it, let alone compete for it, that's a role it can play. But the role that private sector expertise can play in that process is actually, how do you help guide the public sector, the experts, the people in places like Homes England and others, that say that what you actually need, what is it that the private sector will need to de-risk this project? What are the components that need to be put in place? What are the, and there will become a crossover where it becomes very, very easy for the private sector to come in. But if you try and chuck it over the wall, or chuck all the responsibilities over the wall too early, or get the private sector expertise involved too late, you end up with massive difficulties at the beginning of projects, and a lot of them end up in the long grass for a very long time.
Yellow.
I actually think that all of it is ultimately paid by the taxpayer if you equal the taxpayer to a consumer as well. And that's because even if you have an asset where it has been funded purely by the private funder without government support or grants or subsidies, ultimately the prices, let's say there is a demand risk, maybe if it was a fiber project or maybe if it was an energy project, the prices, the cost of those are paid by consumers. If it is a government-funded project, obviously there's a taxpayer's money, and if it's subsidies, ultimately as well. So the difference for me is only who makes money on it and how well is it executed. So possibly might be better executed if there is some expert involvement, and those are probably private counterparties.
Thank you very much, panel. I've heard a very clear story there around competence, risk allocation and partnership. Thank you. Could I invite the next question from the floor, please? Gentleman here.
Henry Chua from M Technologies. I have three comments, two related to what Baroness Randerson has said. The first relates to this PPP expertise. As someone who worked on the very, very first projects back in 1995, and year 2019 is actually year 24 of a PPP contract in this country. So next year is going to be a very interesting year because the year after that, 2021, the very first project will be in handback period. So next year is going to be critical for the government. And this comment relates to this civil service. Thus far, the civil service has not built up an in-house expertise in terms of really managing all these contracts. It relied significantly on the private sector, and many of the original people who dealt with the transactions have all retired. And if you would walk into, say, like Highways England or the private sector, you will not find that many people who knows what has happened before, nor have much knowledge of what is coming. And this is something that I hope if there's any politicians here and civil servants, they might want to take this back. The second point relates to this thing about devolutions. We have a political system where it is very hard for the regions, the mayors, the councils to transact infrastructure projects. We don't have the funding system. 80% of their money comes from the central government. The way to look at this is, let's look at the United States, where the state governments, the municipalities have their funding streams. And even there, they are struggling. They have a very, very well-established muni bonds system. For us to do it, we will need a major transformation of our political system, our local government political system. And I'm not sure if the Westminster village has really grasped that. And also pundits who said that we should devolve more fully appreciate the complexity of that. So that's my second point. And my third point relates to PPP in general. I note as a PPP advisor the important role played by the private sector. But I fear that while what they have done is very helpful, the private sector as a group isn't capable of stepping in to take over some of the heavy lifting from the government. Look at globally. I believe globally there is something like about 70 trillion US dollars of private sector assets. And August institutions like World Bank or even private sector organization like McKinsey has said that the world needs like about 3 trillion of investment in infrastructure per year. for at least the next 10 years. 10% of the global asset at 70 trillion is roughly about 7 trillion. You just don't have enough funds to provide the necessary equity to support the infrastructure needs. So we're back to where we started. The public sector needs to be responsible for the heavy lifting, but we have a population system which is aging. So we are thinking of other investments. So the public sector is forever thinking of how to reduce. So we are in the catch-22 position. Thank you.
Thank you. I shall just summarise before asking Jenny to respond. I think a clear reminder to us all that next year is the 25th anniversary of the initial PPP project, and a challenge posed, I think, as to the capability of the civil service to accept the return of those projects, and another challenge posed about the capability of devolved bodies to raise funding, an interesting parallel drawn with the American model, and then a broader conceptual discussion around the mix of competence, the size of investment challenge. And I'd just like to invite the Baroness Jenny Randerson to give that political response to those comments.
Well, I agree with you totally about the importance of corporate memory in terms of what will happen next year. The policy making Whitehall civil service has a career structure which is based on moving on frequently. And that does not encourage people to become experienced or expert in one little niche. And the result of that is a lack of corporate memory, and people make the same mistakes again and again. So I would agree with you totally there. And yes, we have one of the most centralised states in Europe. We have a desperate need for, I believe, a desperate need for greater devolution. I live in Wales, so we have struggled for the last 20 years since the beginning of Welsh devolution to get greater powers for the Welsh Assembly and the Welsh Government. We have nothing like the amount of power that Scotland has. But I look at Transport for the North. They come and see me and they talk to me about very ambitious plans. And I would politically say to them, absolutely, your areas, your regions need that additional infrastructure investment. But they have virtually no powers and no funding. And I share your doubt as to whether any incoming government is going to have the will and the true desire to drive those powers downwards and the funding that goes with it, because power without the funding is just a real problem. So you've got to be willing, as a government, to hand over the money as well as the power.
Thank you very much. Conscious of time, I'd like to move on to the next question on the floor, please. Come here in the fourth row.
David Biggs, Network Rail Property. Two questions. First one, it's a question in relation to the amount of investment that government puts into infrastructure and the amount of value that can create. Does the panel believe there is sufficient land value capture mechanisms that government and local government can deploy to capture that value to make sure they're properly incentivized in the first place to make that investment? And my second question is, with the country striving to a low-carbon, zero-carbon, sustainable way of being, if you like, is there an argument that there is market failure that we're currently seeing, which is not driving us quickly enough towards that zero-carbon way of living? And does the panel think there are things that should be put in place to accelerate our drive to zero carbon?
David, many thanks. In a moment or two, I shall invite André to respond initially to the question exploring the efficiency and effectiveness of land value capture before turning to Jolanta and Paul with respect to the market failure in zero carbon. André, if you could give us your perspectives on land value capture, that would be great.
Sure. I don't think the answer is yes. There are lots of mechanisms around the world where people have looked at getting land value capture. I think if you typically look at a transport project and a big thing next to it and think that's going to pay for your national transport project, it's not going to happen like that. And I think that just as a general parameters, there was 2.4 billion pounds of investment in infrastructure went into the King's Cross, St Pancras area, and the value of the land purely because if you ignore the hurdle that you have to put in 400 million pounds of infrastructure and then convince people to actually buy something in the first place, then you say, yeah, there's about 600, 700, 800 million real contribution. But by the time you actually have to put the infrastructure in the first place, if you're just looking to sell land, the amount of uplift in value that's created only gets you to about a contribution of 200-ish. So those are just the real facts, and that is right in the middle of central London. The real impact actually happens well beyond the immediate surroundings of these schemes, and too often people look at, well, Stratford should pay for this, or King's Cross should pay for this, or Brent Cross should pay for this, and they do contribute. They do contribute in a way, but if you really want to get an uplift mechanism, you really have to find ways of extending beyond the footprint, whether that is through sill-like mechanisms, whether that's through clubbing, effectively going to a wider footprint and actually getting people to vote on Argent. Do you want to contribute? Do you want to put bonds into these schemes and providing finance in that way in the knowledge that uplift will flow through to them? And the other area where you actually do get a little bit of difficulty politically is when you actually have the people who own the assets are not the people who actually vote in the area. So where you have large rental stocks, where you have large areas of affordable housing, where you almost have a reverse incentive for things to happen, where the last thing that someone who's actually renting, if they're perfectly happy with their area, and particularly if it can result in what I call regeneration, but what happens beyond my boundary is obviously gentrification. You end up with political pressures which actually operate in the opposite way. So, in short, do I think there are adequate methods in London in operation right now? Possibly not, but is it possible with the right political will to put some in place? Yes, provided they look at the appropriately large size footprint of the impact that infrastructure is going to have.
André, thank you. And perhaps I could move to Jolanta to address the issue of market failure and the move to zero carbon, and then Paul.
Sure. So actually, I haven't seen any studies which would tell whether we're investing quickly enough in renewables to reach the 2050 targets. However, I suspect that we're not. So in terms of what would help, so I'll give you an example of battery storage projects. Initially, people became very interested and very eager to invest in those, but the type of revenues or lack of kind of stable revenues on those projects has discouraged investors from investing in them. And what that is causing is that the energy mix is therefore not allowing to move on to fully renewable, because you can't just have renewable assets, because there will be a lot of blackouts in the market. So what would help, but I'm just really skeptical about it, is some kind of floor mechanism that if the government provided, either through what existed there as embedded benefits, if you are positioned to the particular part of the network, distribution or transmission network, you earn certain embedded benefits, and those are there for sure for a certain number of years. That would help. Some kind of floor mechanism may be related to just your total revenues, but then you have you have that basis. I just can't, but I really think that's very difficult. I can't see that we could go back to subsidies or roll out CFDs even into any projects.
And Paul, perhaps I could ask you for your top 2 points.
Well, just actually goes back to Jenny's first point, which is getting better understanding of the private sector and the public sector, because I think the private sector is very simple. It's predictable. It's amoral. The private sector, it will only invest if it makes profits, and it won't invest if it won't. It doesn't matter what it thinks about it. So I'm working with BP, who wants to do CCS, but it won't do it unless it makes a profit. At the moment, CCS is a process which takes existing gas, which can be burnt with no penalties, and converts it. So therefore, it adds cost to the process, and there's no revenue to support that. So therefore, they won't do it. No one will do it. No private sector will do it. So understanding that, and therefore there is an obvious role for government to create revenue support, to create a market. So it's not market failure, it's just market absence. They won't do it unless there's a market. So there's an absolute role in government to turn what are social objectives into revenue, through revenue support, through contracts. Then the private sector will respond. But don't think that the private sector will take a moral position and do things of what should be and what should happen, because they simply won't. And I think that's not understood enough in the public sector, and that's how the private sector you'd get the best out of it.
Thank you, and let's return to the floor for the next question. Gentleman halfway along, please.
Thanks. Ross Gunny-Reid from Infra Capital Partners. Couple of questions, although, Paul, I think you've pretty much just answered my first one on CCS. As you just kind of said there, as a kind of equity investor in infrastructure, when I consider the models that you talked about earlier, my thought initially is, where is the money coming from? Where's the revenue? And I think you've quite clearly said there, at the moment there is no revenue supply for CCS. It's simply adding costs onto a process that currently exists. Now, obviously, government contracts, much like we have in project finance at the moment, could work in that instance. But do you think that's compatible with the RAB model where you described, for instance, in the water sector, there's an obvious customer that pays and the money is collected through an allowed return on capital? And my second question, which Jolanta might also have a view on, is do you think that there is a risk that CCS is merely a stopgap to, obviously, it has a role in hydrogen production, but hydrogen can also be produced using electricity. Now, as the renewable rollout continues and as flexible generation and storage comes to beat the gap, where we no longer need these baseload coal-powered or other coal, gas or oil-powered plants, do you think there is a danger that it's going to be hard to encourage private investment into CCS if this is only seen as a stopgap solution?
Ross, thank you. 2 questions there. First, I shall direct to Paul, really exploring whether the RAB model is suitable for CCS. And a second question for Jolanta, really asking whether a temporary situation is a disincentive. Paul, can I ask you to pick up the first question?
They were rather mine, weren't they? So on the first, just so everyone's clear, we have all paid for wind and solar. So those have contracted with the low carbon, what's called LCCC, a low carbon contract company, which is a government-owned company centrally who contracts originally quite out of the money contracts with providers, and that is, and I hate this word, socialised across the electricity price to us all. I think it should be called anti-socialised, but anyway, that's how it works. Basically, the same is being proposed for CCS. So the RAB model will charge an availability fee to store the CO2, which is passed to the capturers, the power plants, who in turn will pass it to the LCCC, either in your electricity price or gas price. So we will all have a hidden cost of green energy in our bills. So that's how that model works. That's where the funding comes from. And then I've forgotten the second part. Is CCS a stopgap? Well, sort of, yes. In as much as CCS, the technology is there now. We can do it massively. I gave you the figures earlier. There's a spewing out CO2 which will be addressed in the next 10, 15 years and will reach net zero. Clearly, it relies on still using fossil fuels in the process, even though we're capturing it, and has a price to it. You wouldn't do that forever. The more we can do, more nuclear fission and energy efficiency and reduce the carbon actually of our industrial processes, the less you'll need it. So it's a transition, but probably a 50-year transition. At the moment, the economics between what you describe, which is using electrolysis to produce hydrogen, and CCS, that is chalk and cheese. Clearly in 15, 20 years' time, investment might make that come in line, in which case you do less CCS and more electrolysis. But if we've got a prayer of meeting net zero, you need to do CCS for the next 20, 30, 40 years. I'm not saying it's the answer to all our prayers forevermore. It's not. It's still hydrocarbons, and you're still putting it back in the ground. It would be better the more we could, the more we can get ourselves off the drug in total. That'll be better, but that's for 50 years hence.
Paul, many thanks for covering both questions. Jolanta, do you see CCS as a stopgap and therefore a risk?
Well, I think the way I want to comment is that I agree with Paul, first of all, and I don't think that necessarily a short-term projects, even 20-year assets which yield 20 years of revenues are less attractive, because that's the period that we project. And for example, gas peaking plants, I don't really see them surviving beyond that, because then hopefully by that time we have more renewables, and probably the carbon prices are going to be so high that there will be no point having those kind of assets. But people are still eager to invest in them now.
Wanted to add that there's a lot of talk about, well, where's the revenue stream? So the power of the avoided cost is actually quite a big one, and compulsion is quite a big one. There's absolutely no way that I would have put a district heating scheme at King's Cross if it wasn't for two things. One, I wouldn't have got planning permission in Kensington's government without it. And secondly, I could kind of massage my head around the idea that it is quite possible that the market might want lower carbon buildings. And I can't really demonstrate it right now, but, well, given we have to do it, let's actually see how we can embrace that to avoid costs down the road. The business itself is actually now making an operating profit, but just about. But actually, the capital that's gone into it, it's very hard to see how that would ever have been a stacking up business case, other than the fact that I hadn't any choice and the land would have been worthless without it. So, there are areas where the government can, say that, well, we're not going to buy anything unless it does this, or we're not going to allow that thing to come forward if it doesn't do these parameters, because unless it has a degree of compulsion, and people might say, why the hell are you doing that, André, you idiot? You're kind of making it hard for you. Actually, what makes it easy for me is if a level playing field for everybody in the business, and we are compelled to do things, and then the market finds a way, whether it's through avoided cost, whether it's through it being a gateway to achieving stuff, whether it's through regulation in not in regulated asset base sort of way, in just what is allowable, then you can actually have those transformations. And it has had an impact. It has actually meant that district energy schemes, which I would say that a 2005 one isn't perfect, but the ones which are coming forward now are excellent, are really going to make a major impact. And actually, we can see at King's Cross now a route to being able to make the entire estate carbon net zero. We can see a route to achieving that, and that will actually have genuine value, which we could not even have imagined in 2005 when we committed to it.
Thank you very much. And could I seek the next question, please?
Hello, Andrew Cardwell from Amy. I have a double-barrel question, but that seems to be the flavour of the night. Firstly, on carbon tax, I just wondered what's happened to carbon tax, and why wouldn't you use that the revenues from that to fund a response from industry to decarbonisation? And the second is green finance. Probably to Jolanta, this one. I'm just wondering, I'm hearing a lot about green finance lately, just wondering what it is and what sort of drivers you're seeing from investors for green finance, and whether you're having any issues on the supply side finding projects that might qualify for green finance.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Another two-limbed question, asking where is carbon tax? I'll pose that one to Jenny in a minute, and a second question on the appetite and challenges facing green finance. Jenny, grateful if you could explore the carbon tax.
Yes. Well, carbon tax is one of a range of instruments that government can use, and which in Britain governments have generally been pretty slow to take that choice. Personally, I'm always in favour of the mixture of carrot and stick, and taxation also supplemented by other measures. For example, the grants for electric cars, for example, have worked extremely well in Norway, and so you've got to have the two. But there is quite a lot of evidence that the public prefer taxes where they can see the purpose of them. So a carbon tax, which self-evidently encourages you to do a particular thing or not to do a particular thing, is more popular than one which is just self-evidently a money-raising stunt. The government's going to have to rethink, by the way, vehicle taxation pretty soon.
Paul.
Is it just on the carbon tax? It's very controversial. The problem about it, and industry it's quite heavy on this, which is if you tax industry, all you do is make them competitive because the carbon tax isn't introduced internationally. So, I'll give you an example. CF Fertilisers is the largest producer of nitrogen in the world for agriculture. If we slap on a carbon tax, all we'll do is just give the business elsewhere. So, I gave the data about we've only reduced our emissions by 3%. That's because we've offshored a lot of our industry. So what industry will say is don't do that. If you don't do that and do what we're recommending as a model which can get funded by centrally and effectively by us as consumers or taxpayers, so CF Fertilisers can decarbonise at no cost to themselves rather than the cost of the economy, then what you can do as a government is not impose taxes, but you can impose standards. So if I say to CF Fertilisers, your emissions must fall in this way over the next 15 years, and this is the model which means you can get that financed by some other mechanism, then I can be draconian on the targets because I haven't destroyed their business in doing it. In fact, I've made them more competitive internationally because they are seen to have a clean product.
Thank you. And Jolanta, in respect to the green finance.
So I think I remember half of the question, but I'll start. So green finance, so there is quite a lot of money chasing green projects. And the reason for it is that a lot of investors have introduced these or adopted ideas of ESG or green asset, and that is really part of their policy. And they have to tick certain boxes and really do that. And that's not only in the UK, but it's in Europe, it's really, really prominent. So there is keen money to invest in green assets. And I think the second part was about whether that's...
Whether you have trouble
finding the assets, yeah. So what we have trouble finding are assets where I can justify to my investment committee that the risks are not there. Because the risks are predominantly stemming from revenue risks, because all the other risks, such as construction or operational risks, we can take and we can manage, and a lot of green assets don't actually have such high operational risks or construction risks. So it's really the revenues that are exposed to risks, and if they're not, then the competition for them is so high that it almost makes no point competing for them.
Thank you. We are moving towards the latter stages of our Q&A, so we are seeking brevity in both questions and panel responses. Where's my next question, please? Gentleman here on the fourth row.
Thank you very much. I'm Markus Kleiner from HCOB Bank from Hamburg. Just a question or an add-up to the last question. I think if I look to different medias like Financial Times and the discussion there is on ESG and on green finance, this is very often the case where a lack of standards. When I follow you, Jolanta, it was a bit the case as well, but you said there are different views on it. So how do you see how should this concept at all be implemented? Common standard for all Europe, and of course with a British now extra standard, or how should this work?
Thank you. The issue of standards for the UK and for Europe in the context of green finance, a topical question, Jolanta.
I would predict that we'll argue a bit about standards, assuming that we leave the EU, which I'd rather not do, but but we'll argue about standards. But in the end, we will follow EU standards because there's a reason why China follows EU standards. They're generally world leading, aren't they? Not always, but generally. So I think there'll be a tussle, but in general, in order to do a deal within a reasonable time frame with the EU, we're going to have to follow their standards.
I would just say that ultimately the standard is just one, to achieve no carbon, but to have clean energy and health societies therefore. And that goal then creates certain standards, and probably those that are developed in Europe, I would agree with Jenny, that are at the top.
But there is a green bond standard already out there, so for debt finance, and actually it's an accredited thing, and that the organisations are UK based just by history rather than anything else, and London's been a great issuer. So you can imagine a world where that standard, which has been used for bond finance, could be rolled out to equity as well, so that it's just the accreditation is it's green, the purpose of the asset is green. So there is a standard on the debt side, and maybe the equity could emulate.
Thank you. And returning to the floor for further questions.
Thank you. Simon Fippard at Bird and Bird. A question for the Baroness, if I may. You talked at the beginning of your presentation about some of the sort of political, constitutional impediments to getting the kind of infrastructure we need. I wonder whether you had any other countries in mind where they do these things better in a way that might better meet our requirements, but which perhaps also meet your Britishness requirement that you mentioned.
An excellent question. What can we learn from elsewhere to overcome some of those impediments that the Baroness so clearly articulated, but still retain that British feeling?
Well, the obvious example in my personal experience is France, where they build infrastructure in general, having gone through a democratic consultation process, but they tend to do it rather more swiftly than we do. And they're very keen on infrastructure in France. I mean, they build it all the time. Wherever you go, you can't have a road atlas of France from one year to the next without finding that the next year when you go, it's out of date. Now, you don't have that problem with the road atlas in Britain, do you? So I would give the example of France, unless someone turns around and says to me, oh, no, it's a terrible system, but they have democracy, they build the stuff.
Thank you. And there is opportunity for one very final question.
Hello, Bernie Rowell, HS2. We've been talking really about what I'd call traditional infrastructure, so railways, of which HS2 is one, station upgrades, roads, etc., etc. Is there a tipping point where we kind of switch over to more digital infrastructure to challenge some of the issues we've got around carbon, today, and kind of the pressures on our existing transport systems? And what are the kind of things that might be preventing that kind of investment in digital? Because I've had a mobile phone for 10 years. I've got two on me now. I've got a laptop and an iPad, and yet we still kind of all congregate in one place to talk about things, and people still are travelling. So, where is that kind of tipping point within digital versus traditional infrastructure?
Thank you very much. Our final question: where is the tipping point? What will digitalisation bring, and what can we do to bring it forward? What's preventing its realisation? I'm going to ask each panel member to give nothing more than the 20-second answer to that question. Who would like to go first?
Thanks for that. Yeah, in a lot of infrastructure, there isn't one. Yeah. I mean, carbon capture and storage, puking out CO2, digitisation is not going to impact that whatsoever. So I'll say in a good chunk of infrastructure, which is still about moving people, what's happened to railways since you've had your computer and phone, it's actually gone up in terms of ridership, not down. So I'm not sure there is a tipping point in infrastructure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree and not say that there is a tipping point, but definitely that digitalization and data transition, it's one of the core focus of ours at least, and it will definitely be for the future. And again, similarly to energy, the risks are here, demand risks and revenue risks, because it's all ultimately supported by the consumer.
So I think the digital layers can actually bring lots of operational efficiency, operational effectiveness into infrastructure, even at the scale at which we're doing it. And when we implement new bits of infrastructure, we need to ensure that not only do we put the digital in layer from the outside, we also put 14 purple pipes in the ground, which cost us 3p a meter, because I don't know what else I'm going to need. I'm going to want to be able to capture the opportunities. But one of the difficulties that we have in terms of using the digital layer to make operation more effective, to make user experience more effective, to make all of these things are good regardless of who your customers or your taxpayers are, to make processes more efficient is actually the Babelfish problem of it, is that lots of systems where you take digital and they have to make take sense information, process data, and then make things do things. There's not really good common platform standards to actually take advantage of these things, and I think a lot of the investment that we're doing and our colleagues related in the States have actually done in spades at Hudson Yards about actually putting in place middleware where they can take the brains and the data management of digital and actually apply it to managing real-world problems and improving real-world quality experiences and actually driving through operational effectiveness, which should fundamentally de-risk this thing. That's where the actual real challenge is, and that's where a lot of our investment is going to be going shortly. Well, currently.
The key point is that every infrastructure project should have the capacity built in, but the difficult bit is guessing what the direction will eventually be, because you have to anticipate the future. I'll just give you one brief reference as an example, which is digital signalling on the railways, which is incredibly complex in Britain because we have such an old and famously old railway system. We were the first, so therefore we have the oldest system, and it requires a real guessing game almost for the people building new rail infrastructure, that they get the digital capacity right now, which they don't actually have the ability to link up with everything immediately, but it needs to be there now.
Well,
and I see someone from Network Rail nodding, so hopefully that was right.
Thank you all. That brings us to the close of the Q&A. And I think this question, how does one summarise what has been such a wide-ranging discussion? We've covered all of the ground, the various financing options, the differing roles of the state, some of the contextual challenges into which some of the investments face. We've covered the policy domain. We've covered areas of practicality. But what I think we've done is really brought to life the vibrancy, the talent, the competence that exists in our infrastructure sector here in the UK. But the area of consistency I did hear from the panels was almost, I suppose, an ask, a request, perhaps a request to government, perhaps a request to the public sector for appropriate risk allocation, for partnership, for appropriate regulation, for consistency in decision making and planning, things to make the unlocking of the flow of investments much, much easier. I'd like to start by firstly extending my thanks to this evening's panel. I think they did us proud with the ground they covered. I hope you all found it interesting and informative. Thank you ever so much, panel. I would also like to thank you all for attending. I do hope you have some spare time to join us in the room next door for some networking and some drinks. And I really hope you've enjoyed this evening's Movement Matters. Thank you.